Good morning. Welcome to worship with the community of Westside Unitarian Universalist Church, where compassion leads us to work for justice and equality. My name is Michael Munoz, and I am your worship leader this morning. I'm glad you are joining us in this service today. It is my hope that this gathering will renew your sense of community and connection and nourish your heart, mind, and spirit. Thank you to our AV team volunteers today, host Caroline Nixon, co-host Jonathan Sarmiento, and Janelle Weaver. And special thanks to Yuki Kumamoto for selecting and playing beautiful music throughout the service, as well as our loyal Director of Lifespan Religious Education, Nikki Kennedy, for her selection and execution for Time for All Ages. At Westside, we are raising the next generation of Unitarian Universalists, and we want them to know that they are an important part of our community. Several years ago, we chose to be radically inclusive and to adopt a multi-generational worship, where our services include all family members. So welcome to all children and youth of all ages. Westside is a community of many beliefs, genders, and sexualities. A community of diverse racial and class backgrounds. A community of varied beliefs and gifts. Some here find inspiration in the great books, others in the great outdoors, and others still in great conversations. Whoever you may be, we welcome you to bring your whole self into this community. If you are so moved, you can try out the chat feature on Zoom by typing in some words of welcome to both members and visitors who are joining us this morning. On behalf of this church community, I say to all, welcome. I invite you to take a deep breath. And from wherever you are, settle into this sacred space that we created together. Now let us worship together as we listen to this morning's prelude. Our opening words are from Reverend Tim Haley, entitled, Amid All the Noise in Our Lives. Amid all the noise in our lives, we take this moment to sit in silence, to give thanks for another day, to give thanks for all those in our lives who have brought us warmth and love, to give thanks for the gift of life. We know we are on our pilgrimage here, but a brief moment in time. Let us open ourselves here, now, to the process of becoming more whole, of living more fully, of giving and forgiving more freely, of understanding more completely, the meaning of our lives here on this earth. Our opening hymn this morning is 347, Gather the Spirit, performed by Jim Scott, revised lyrics by Pat LaManna.
I wrote this song 30 years ago so my friend Pat LaManna could give it this contemporary message. Gather in spirit, not face to face. Let's do what we can to flatten the curve. Wash your hands often and don't touch your face. This virus is something no one deserves. Gather on Skype, gather on Zoom, gather by phone with family and friends. Gather online, but don't leave your room. Let's all stay safe until this crisis ends. Gather on Facebook, but not for too long. There's so many ways to sweeten the time. Take up crochet, write a new song, read a good book, bake brownies sublime. Gather on Skype, gather on Zoom, gather by phone with family and friends. Gather online, but don't leave your room. Let's all stay safe until this crisis ends. Gather in spirit, pray for the scared, the sick and the poor, the lonely at home. Count all your blessings and reach out and share. Let everyone know that they're not alone. Gather in Skype, gather on Zoom, gather by phone with family and friends. Gather online, but don't leave your room. Let's all stay safe until this crisis ends.
The flaming chalice is our Unitarian Universalist symbol of both the heritage of our past and the light of hope within this congregation today. Join Alice and James Craig in lighting our chalice at home to the words of Robin Slaw.
We light this chalice to envision who we might become.
We become our best selves when we let go of what holds us back, when we let in love and light and justice.
We become our best selves when we honor all parts of ourselves, when we share our gifts with the world, when we overcome our fears.
We become our best selves when we live in harmony with our earth, when we notice the beauty around us, when we do our part to save our planet.
We become our best selves when we dream about a better world, when we dream ways of healing hearts, when we challenge injustices and build equity.
Today, we light this chalice to envision who we will become.
Our chalice lighting song is Be the Light by Liam Morris, followed by our affirmation recited by Oliver Munoz.
There is always a light. When we're ready to see it, there is always a light. When we're ready to be it, to see the light, to be the light, to raise our eyes in the dark of night, to climb this hill, together we will.
There is always a light.
There is always a light.
There is always a
When
light.
we're ready to see it, there is always a light.
There is always a
When
light.
we're ready to be it, to see the light, to be the light, to raise our eyes in the dark of night, to climb this hill, together we will.
There is always a light. There is always a light. There is always a light. There is always a light.
See the light, be the light, raise our eyes in the dark of night, to climb this hill, together we will.
There is always a light. There is always a light. There is always a light. There is always a light.
See the light, be the light, raise our eyes in the dark of night, to climb this hill, together we will. Be the light.
Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve others in community, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with creation. Thus do we covenant with one another.
Good morning, Westsiders. I am so happy to be with you guys today. Maybe you can hear the birds chirping in the background and the wind blowing. I hope you are all able to get outside and enjoy today as well. So this week I had the privilege to record the reflection for today, and I was able to talk with Layne, who's giving the reflection about our time for all ages this morning. Today's reflection is about the importance of telling the whole story, telling the important parts of the story. The parts that sometimes get left out are just as important. Layne found a beautiful video that talks about the beginning of COVID-19 and how a caring and passionate doctor tried to help prepare the community for this unknown virus that he was seeing. As you watch this video, we hope you will all think about it from this perspective. And another reason why listening to everyone and why community really matters. You're encouraged to talk with your family and your friends as we continue to learn and to do better. Thanks for starting the video, Caroline.
Dr. Lee and the crown-wearing virus. Once upon a time, there was a very good doctor in China. His name was Dr. Li Wenliang, and he was an eye doctor. Every day, Dr. Li went to work at the hospital in a city called Wuhan to treat his patients. He saw patients with all kinds of issues. Some needed glasses so they could see from afar. Others needed them to see things up close. And some elderly patients needed small operations so that they could just see better. Dr. Lee loved his job and took care of all his patients with joy. One day, however, he noticed something strange. He observed that instead of having many different problems, his patients all seemed to be suffering from the same illness. It appeared to be a terrible cold, like the flu, but was unlike any other flu that Dr. Lee had treated in the past. The doctor immediately sent a message to his colleagues to warn them that this strange flu was going around and tell them that, though he didn't know exactly what it was, it appeared to be very contagious because he had already seen 7 patients with it. The following day, police officers went and knocked on the doctor's door. They told him he had to stop sending messages or else they would arrest him and put him in prison. They thought the doctor was getting worked up for no reason, and they didn't want him to frighten the other doctors. But as the days went by, more and more people got sick with this strange flu. Now there were very many ill patients. Dr. Lee's colleagues quickly realized that he had been right. This flu was caused by a virus that they had never seen before. They began working together. There were those who observed the virus in the laboratory to understand how it spread, others who treated patients, and those who tried to develop a vaccine to protect people. For every patient they treated and every hour they spent in the laboratory, the researchers, doctors, and nurses learned something new. They discovered that it was a virus that was part of a family called the coronavirus, a type of virus that when you looked at it under a microscope appeared to have a crown on its head. Corona is another word for crown. The police apologized to Dr. Lee, but unfortunately, it was too late. The doctor had fallen ill and died a few days later. The doctors discovered that the virus came from an animal, possibly a bat or a snake, but they couldn't be sure. It wasn't easy to know for certain because the virus couldn't be questioned. Normally, viruses found in animals don't make humans sick, but this was a new virus, and a lot of research would have to be done to understand its behavior. In the meantime, though, they had to find a way to protect as many people as possible from getting sick. The researchers discovered something important. Even people who didn't have a cough or fever could hug, touch, or kiss someone and unknowingly transmit the virus to them. They discovered that when a person coughed or sneezed and a few tiny drops of saliva landed on a door handle or an elevator button, someone who then touched that same handle or button even hours later could get infected with the virus. They also discovered that washing your hands thoroughly with soap made the virus disappear. Finding a vaccine became urgent so that people could stop worrying when they hugged each other or called the elevator. In fact, vaccines protect people from getting sick even when they come in contact with the virus. It's thanks to vaccines that we are no longer afraid of getting measles or chickenpox. But what could be done to prevent people from getting sick while researchers around the world were trying to develop a vaccine? The scientists came to a conclusion. People had to be asked to stay home because this way the virus couldn't spread and there would be fewer people falling ill. Those who did get sick would get the care they needed, and the researchers would have time to find a solution. The doctors in Wuhan told their colleagues in other countries about the new virus, but many thought it was a Chinese problem and wouldn't affect them, so they weren't concerned. But in a few days' time, the virus arrived in Italy, France, the United States, Spain, Germany. In the beginning, nobody wanted to believe it. Just like the police officers from Wuhan had done, the other governments around the world also refused to listen to the scientists. "It's not a big deal," they said. But sick people kept coming into the hospital, and soon there would be no more beds left to put them in. Shortly after, other countries around the world also started telling people to stay home and that children were no longer allowed to go to school. How long will this last? The children asked. But the adults didn't know. They did know, however, that even though the schools were closed, the kids had to keep up with their schoolwork and studies. This is because it would take many doctors like Dr. Lee, many teachers, many scientists, and many researchers for people to once again hug each other and take the elevator together without having to worry about a thing.
Our joys and concerns will be shared by Christina Sellers, a representative of the pastoral care team.
Good morning. As we share our joys with others, those joys are multiplied. When other hearts know our joy shines all the brighter. As we share our concerns, our community can offer its care. When other hearts know our sorrow, our burden becomes lighter. This is the time in our service when we offer witness and support for one another's journeys. Please post in the chat if you have a joy or concern you would like to share with everyone today and those who will watch the recording later. Joys and concerns can be submitted at any time via email to pastoralcare@westsideu.org or through the web form located on the Care and Support page of the church's website. We haven't had any joys and concerns submitted via email this week. Okay. Nikki Kennedy is thankful for such great weather. Second that one.
Swimming.
Patty wants to go swimming. Caroline Nixon has a concern for all those that are still losing their lives to COVID. Cindy Fountain has a concern about the voter suppression, anti-LGBTQ, and anti-reproductive justice bills that are very concerning. Please engage and let your voices be heard. The Texas legislature is in session right now, and that's what she's referring to. And Cindy, I think there is a way to sign up for your alerts. I know I get emails from Cindy that have issues that are coming across the Texas legislature when bills are up in committee or when they're being voted on, and it gives really specific instructions on how to speak out to your representatives or the people on the committees. So I recommend that. There we go. All I'm seeing this morning. Thank you for sharing those with us. It's good to share with one another as sharing draws our community closer together. Please know that our pastoral care associates are available to support you with deep listening and when needed through our InReach Fund for short-term financial support of members in need. We are here for you.
Thank you, Christina. This morning's centering song, 391, Voice Still and Small.
Voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In storm and rain, sorrow and pain, still will remain singing. Calling my fears
I invite you to join me in a time of centering. Each week here at Westside, we open our hearts to those in our community who know both joys and challenges, and to all suffering beings. I will begin with a brief introduction before we move into a time for silent reflection. I will ring a bell to start at the start of the time for your own meditation, prayer, or reflection, and I will ring the bell again at the end. I invite you and your families to close your eyes and check in with your body, sitting tall and relaxed as I begin. I will begin our meditation with words from the Reverend Dr. Cynthia Landrum. Spirit of life and love, we gather together in different ways this morning. From computer screens, from telephones, from car radios, we gather, reaching out across the wires, waving from a safe distance to come together in religious community. From living room to front porch to car seat, we gather as we are able, ready to be of service to each other, to the world, ready to build the community of hope and of love as we face this bright morning. We are apart, but we are together, offering our love, our commitment, our hope, and our prayers in service to one another and this world. It is a new way, but an old way, that we come together in worship today. May it be so, blessed be, and amen.
Good morning, Cindy Fountain here. Westside's plate offering for April is Equality Texas. Equality Texas envisions a Texas where lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Texans and their families have full equality in the hearts and minds of our fellow Texans and in all areas of the law. It does this through political action, education, community organizing, and collaboration. Equality Texas during this legislative session is giving testimony in Austin on bills both for and against our LGBTQ Texans, with its top priority being the passage of a comprehensive non-discrimination bill for the first time in Texas history. Last year, Westside renewed its commitment through the UUA to be a welcoming congregation to our LGBTQ community. It is a commitment Westside has maintained for almost 15 years. Let's continue to be a welcoming congregation by supporting an organization that advocates for LGBTQ Texans. Give online now through the church's giving page or by using the Give Plus app. Select the Service Project Fund, and the link will be put in the chat. You can also mail a check to the church. Thank you for your offering. And now enjoy this musical offering from Yuki Kumamoto.
Thank you for your generosity. Our reflection this morning is presented by our very own Westside member, Dr. Layne Craig.
Good morning, friends. Many of you might know that part of my work at TCU is research and teaching in the field of literature and medicine. So what I love about literature and medicine is that stories about healthcare are so often stories about access to healthcare and stories about the way in which communities and family and society value different bodies in different ways and at different times. And I love to look into how stories depict those aspects of our lives. I published this reflection earlier this year. It's about one of my favorite novels that deals with illness, and I published it in a medical history blog called Nursing Cleo. The Westside Worship Committee asked me to share it with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts on what we might learn from stories about the last pandemic in 1918. So the published title of this blog post is Not Our First Rodeo, Reading Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider through the lens of Denver newspapers' coverage of the 1918 flu pandemic. It begins, weathering the COVID-19 pandemic in Fort Worth, Texas, I'm continually dismayed by the ways that money and politics are prioritized over human life all around me. In November, for example, our mayor cheerfully hosted a national rodeo competition, bringing in thousands of tourists during a period when we had fewer than 20 available ICU beds countywide. As 2021 begins, with appropriate celebration over the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine, my fear is that the stories that we tell about this pandemic will become stories of scientific triumph punctuated by personal grief. These are important narratives, but they can short-circuit accountability for our real failures of structure and leadership, accountability I think we need to prepare for the next crisis. This anxiety led me back to the work of one of my favorite writers, fellow Texan Katherine Anne Porter, whose 1939 novella, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, is one of very few literary representations of the 1918 flu pandemic. So, Katherine Anne Porter was born in Indian Creek, Texas in 1890. After escaping an abusive marriage, she moved to Fort Worth in 1917 and began her journalism career here. She began writing short stories in 1935, and in 1966, she won a Pulitzer Prize in literature. One of her short stories, Noon Wine, was made into an episode of PBS's American Playhouse in the 1980s, and that episode was filmed at Cindy Fountain's great-great-grandparents' house in Fredericksburg. So Katherine Anne Porter is basically a Westsider. Literary historians have different explanations for why there were so few accounts of the 1918 flu pandemic, but most people seem to think that because World War I was happening at the same time, it was really difficult to tell stories about illness and this kind of mass tragedy right after another kind of mass tragedy that in some ways was easier to explain and describe. Pale Horse, Pale Rider is based on Porter's own experiences contracting the flu in Denver, Colorado, while working for the Rocky Mountain News. It follows Miranda, a reporter for the Blue Mountain News, over the course of one day in which she resists and eventually succumbs to flu symptoms, cared for by her soldier boyfriend, Adam. Ultimately, Miranda, like Porter, recovers after an injection of strychnine in the hospital. However, when she awakes, she learns that Adam has not survived his own bout of flu. Pale Horse, Pale Rider reads as a deeply personal story, not only because of its autobiographical origins, but also because it follows Miranda's point of view even as she becomes delirious with fever. Vivid imagery and biblical symbolism dominate the last section of the novel, as Porter uses modernist literary techniques like stream of consciousness to explore Miranda's internal experience of the flu. Rereading this text during our current pandemic, though, I realize that as a reader, I've overlooked Porter's depiction of the external, of her community's response to the threat of pandemic illness as Miranda goes about a seemingly normal day while her symptoms worsen. I turned to online archives of local journalism, considering Porter's own experiences with local journalism, to test the theory that Pale Horse Pale Rider should be read not only for its depiction of an individual's struggle with illness, but also for its lessons about a city struggling to respond to a crisis in a culture hampered by the pressures of nationalism and capitalism, lessons that are all too applicable to our current moment. In November 1918, the Denver city government published in its monthly newsletter, Municipal Facts, an evaluation of its citizens' response to the deadly autumn. The editor stated, "For some reason, even the most enlightened citizens will not take the influenza epidemic seriously. They know that the disease is a deadly menace and snuffs out life almost before the victim realizes he is ill. Yet, when health officers try to impress upon the public the necessity of following essential rules and regulations, the average citizen simply refuses to heed these admonitions." This harsh take fits a historical narrative of Denver's response to the flu. Although the city's churches and businesses supported a closing order on October 6, 1918, citizens quickly employed loopholes, such as congregating outdoors, which was much more dangerous with the Spanish flu than with our current COVID-19. Business owners also lobbied for a quick reopening, even as cases continued to climb throughout the fall. When a second wave rose after Armistice Day celebrations in November, most Denverites refused to follow mask orders, and the mayor essentially threw up his hands and gave up on enforcement. The real-life Rocky Mountain News flu coverage in late September and early October foreshadowed the city's difficulties facing the pandemic's realities. The paper covered influenza extensively as a national concern and as one facing the military camps near Boulder. However, headlines advertised a lack of cases in Denver. A September 29th headline stated, "No influenza in city, health manager says." An October 1st article title repeated, "No influenza in city, asserts Dr. Sharpley." That's the same health manager. On October 3rd, the public was again told, "No cases reported so far in Denver." This is all despite the fact that a confirmed flu death did occur in late September in Denver, as the September 29th story confirmed. This is a quote, "The funeral of Miss Blanche Kennedy, who died Friday morning of Spanish influenza, will take place later this afternoon." Blanche Kennedy's death didn't count because the disease was in this case contracted in Chicago. Unfortunately, it was later discovered that Blanche Kennedy had spread the flu to her immediate family in Denver, and several members of her family died. The Denver of the novel, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, is similarly blasé about the approaching disaster. Men are, quote, "dying like flies in the army encampments near Denver, where Adam is stationed. But theaters and restaurants are open." Miranda tells Adam of the funny new sickness, and she says it seems to be a plague, as they stroll together down streets and are constantly interrupted by funeral processions crossing in front of them. But at the same time, she downplays her own symptoms and seems to not realize that she is clearly feverish and coming down with this illness. The only extended conversation about influenza occurs among her newspaper colleagues, who joke about conspiracy theories, claiming influenza is a German biological weapon. In reviewing the U.S. news coverage of influenza in September 1918, journalism historian Tom Dick has applied the term cognitive inertia, suggesting that Americans did not take flu preparation seriously because they couldn't overcome the assumption that the flu was a mild disease affecting only vulnerable populations. Denver's paper's coverage of the flu, as well as Porter's novella, seem to confirm his theory. These same sources also show, though, that cognitive inertia isn't just a personal psychological barrier. It's also an effect produced by culture. In the case of Denver in 1918, the city's and the nation's immersion in World War I created a delayed response to the flu, based in people's resistance to adjusting the nationalist priorities of wartime. Porter hints in her novel that Miranda literally sacrifices her health for the war effort as she performs volunteer hospitality work with convalescing soldiers the day before her symptoms started, implying that that's where she picked up the flu. The continuation of women's inessential volunteer war work as the flu outbreak emerged seems to have been drawn from life. The Rocky Mountain News ran a notice banning workers who have colds from volunteering at the Red Cross on October 6th, the same day that the city issued the order closing businesses and schools, suggesting that women's war work continued right up until the last possible second, although this work consisted of handing out magazines and greeting soldiers who were sick. Nationalist fervor is also represented as a danger to human life in Porter's representation of local theater. Miranda and Adam attend a, quote, long, dreary play that she has to review for her work. At intermission, they're subjected to a speech urging the audience to buy Liberty bonds. Porter ends the scene with a grim image, and this is kind of a long quote. The audience rose and sang, their open mouths black and faces pallid in the reflected footlights. Some of the faces grimaced and wept and had shining streaks like snails' tracks on them. We can read this description as just another of many images of death in this novella. However, the pallid audience not only evokes death through their kind of zombie-like appearance, but they also cause each other's deaths. They're spreading the virus through their loud performance of patriotism by singing together at the theater. The theater in Pale Horse, Pale Rider is a venue for performative patriotism, but it's also a place of commerce, as Porter reminds us by having Miranda attend not for pleasure, but as a requirement of her job. My survey of Denver newspapers suggests that one of the most publicized debates about the city's business closures revolved around theaters. As early as October 12th, the Rocky Mountain News ran a story titled, "Theaters Loss Heavy," claiming Denver theaters were losing $15,000 per week. On November 23rd, after the reemergence of the flu following Armistice Day, the same paper reported, quote, managers of all the Denver theaters and moving pictures asked the news to put them on the record as voicing a strong protest against closure orders. The theater managers were arguing that since department stores were allowed to open, the continued closure of theaters unfairly targeted their businesses. In this context, Porter's representation of the theater as a place of death reads as a reminder of the human cost of such disputes and their ensnarement with capitalist assumptions about what economic freedom really is. At this point in 2021, we're already familiar with the human interest stories that have been written about the COVID-19 pandemic. The most compelling are about deep grief, or amazing recovery, or isolation due to quarantine. Zadie Smith, one of the great essayists of our time, published her collection, Intimations, last summer already. Her publisher advertised it as a deeply personal account of the experience of evacuation and quarantine in New York City in spring 2020. However, just like those of the 1918 pandemic, the stories about COVID-19's devastation are as much about social breakdown as they are about individuals' experiences and suffering. When we read and tell stories about this crisis, just like the last crisis, we need to be vigilant for the ways in which the personal can sometimes erase the political, and work to keep our governments and our community's shortcomings in the foreground, even as we express empathy for people whose suffering needs to be told and need to share their stories. If we can do this, our communities might be better prepared for our next pandemic rodeo.
Our closing words are the Reverend Anna Sandler Michaels benediction for a peoples in pandemic. When faced with a challenge such as this, we can turn towards one another, or we can turn against. We can ignore the cries of our neighbors, or we can let them cry into the arms of our witness. We can respond with indifference to systemic injustice, or we can commit to its undoing. Good souls, tales will be told of how we respond when this particular hell was visited upon our earth. Let us know and let it be said by generations to come that when the pain of our separation was revealed, we moved closer to the promised land of our beloved community. Amen. Join me in congregational closing as we extinguish our chalices. Let us go in peace, believe in peace, and create peace in our lives and in the world. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.